My name is Willa June Patterson. I'm 72 years old, and 3 weeks ago I walked out of prison after serving 15 years for killing my own daughter with a bullet to the head. Most folks here in Tellico Plains still cross the street when they see me coming, whispering behind their hands about the woman who committed the sin that goes against nature itself. But I'm also the same woman who bakes apple pies for the church bake sale every third Sunday, who feeds stray cats behind Miller's grocery store, and who still says grace before every meal, even when I'm eating alone at this old kitchen table that's seen more tears than food lately. Funny how two truths can live in the same person, ain't it? I know what you're thinking. How does a grandmother, a woman who spent 43 years teaching Sunday school to little ones with sticky fingers and gap-toothed smiles, end up pointing a gun at her own flesh and blood? How does a woman who couldn't even kill a spider without feeling guilty for 3 days afterward pull that trigger on the child she brought into this world? Well, honey, some stories are so tangled up in darkness that only the person who lived through every twisted turn can tell you where the truth really lies. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. Lord knows I've wrestled with that demon long enough on my own. I'm just asking you to listen, really listen, to what happened in the shadows before that terrible night when everything came to light. Because what they wrote in those newspapers, what that prosecutor told that jury, what this whole town believes about me, well, that's only half the story. And the other half, the half that explains why I did what no mother should ever have to do, that's the part I'm finally ready to tell. You willing to take this journey with me, sugar? Because once we start walking down this particular road, there ain't no turning back. You see, my daughter Serafina wasn't born like other children. Now don't get me wrong, she was beautiful, Lord have mercy, with these big green eyes that seemed to hold secrets even when she was just learning to walk. But there was something else there too, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up even when she was cooing in her crib like any normal baby. I remember the first time I really noticed it. She couldn't have been more than 4 years old, sitting on the front porch steps with her little legs swinging back and forth. Mrs. Henderson from next door had come over with fresh tomatoes from her garden. Bless her heart, she was always trying to help a young widow, trying to raise a child alone. Well, Serafina looked up at that sweet old woman with those angel eyes of hers and said, clear as day, Mrs. Henderson, you're going to die soon, aren't you? You smell different now. I nearly dropped that basket of tomatoes right there on the porch. Mrs. Henderson went white as a sheet and made some excuse about needing to get home. 3 weeks later, they found her collapsed in her kitchen. Heart attack, the doctor said. Could have happened to anyone her age. But I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow my 4-year-old daughter had known. As Serafina grew older, these moments became more frequent. She'd make observations about people that no child should make, telling the preacher's wife that her husband was thinking about other ladies, or mentioning to our mailman that his wife was putting something in his coffee to make him sleepy. And the terrible thing was, she was always right, always. By the time she hit school age, teachers were calling her gifted, exceptional, a little genius. They said I should be proud to have such an intelligent child. And I was proud, Lord knows I was. But pride and fear can live in the same heart, can't they? Because while other mothers worried about their children not being smart enough, I found myself lying awake at night wondering if mine was too smart for her own good, or for mine. The way she'd watch people, like she was studying them, cataloging their weaknesses. The way she'd smile when someone was in pain, not the cruel smile of a mean child, but something else, something clinical, like she was observing an interesting experiment. The way she'd manipulate situations so smoothly that even I, her own mother, wouldn't realize what she'd done until hours later. When she turned 8, I found her sitting in her room one evening, drawing pictures. Most children that age draw stick figures in wobbly houses, maybe a sun with a smiley face. Serafina was drawing detailed anatomical diagrams of the human body, marking pressure points and arteries with the precision of a medical textbook. When I asked her where she'd learned such things, she just looked up at me with those green eyes and said, I figured it out myself, Mama. It's not that hard once you understand how things work inside. That night, I knelt beside my bed and prayed harder than I'd ever prayed in my life. I asked God to help me understand my child, to show me how to love her the right way, to protect her from whatever darkness seemed to be growing inside that brilliant little mind. But I also prayed, and I'm ashamed to admit this, for Him to protect me from her too, because by then, even at 8 years old, my daughter had this way of looking at me sometimes that made me feel like prey. like she was calculating something I couldn't begin to understand. And the worst part wasn't that she might be dangerous, the worst part was that I was starting to believe she already was. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that grief from losing my husband had made me paranoid, that no mother should think such things about her own child. But deep down, in that place where mothers know things they wish they didn't, I was beginning to understand that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with my little girl. And that's when everything started to fall apart, piece by piece, like a house built on sand during a storm that just won't end. The years between 8 and 18 were like watching a storm build on the horizon. You know it's coming, but you keep hoping it'll change direction before it reaches your front door. Serafina grew more beautiful with each passing year, and Lord, she was smart as a whip. Teachers would call me in for conferences just to gush about her exceptional abilities. How she was reading at a college level by age 10, how she could solve math problems that stumped kids twice her age. But living with her was like sharing a house with a beautiful, calculating stranger who happened to have my eyes and her daddy's chin. She learned early on how to use her intelligence like a weapon, but not in the obvious ways you might think. No, my Serafina was far too clever for that. She'd correct me in front of church ladies with such sweet concern in her voice, mentioning how I'd gotten confused about dates again, or gently suggesting I might want to rest more, since I seemed so forgetful lately. The way she'd say it, dripping with daughterly love, made everyone think what a caring child she was, while making me feel about 2 inches tall. I started noticing how she'd watch people at church, at the grocery store, anywhere we went, not the way a normal child watches, curious and open, but like a scientist studying specimens under a microscope. She'd come home and tell me things about our neighbors that she couldn't possibly know, intimate details about their marriages, their fears, their secrets. When I'd ask how she knew such things, she'd just smile that mysterious smile and tell me she was good at reading people. The summer she turned 15, I found her journal tucked under her mattress while I was changing sheets. I know I shouldn't have read it. A mother's supposed to respect her child's privacy. But something deep in my gut told me I needed to know what was going on in that brilliant, frightening mind of hers. What I found made my blood run cold. Page after page of observations about our neighbors, their routines, their vulnerabilities. She'd written detailed notes about Mrs. Carter's drinking problem, about how Mr. Phillips beat his wife when he thought no one was looking, about the preacher's gambling debts that he hid from the congregation. But worse than that were her plans, not violent plans, nothing you could call the police about, but manipulation schemes, ways to use people's secrets against them, methods to make them do what she wanted without them even realizing they were being controlled. I confronted her about it that very night, my hands shaking as I held that journal. She listened to my concerns with such patience, such understanding in those green eyes. Then she apologized so sweetly, explaining that she'd been writing stories, fiction pieces for school, and hadn't I always encouraged her creativity. She was so convincing, so genuinely remorseful, that I almost believed her. Almost. But I'd learned to watch for the signs by then. The way her mouth would twitch just slightly when she lied. The way her eyes would go flat and cold for just a split second before she'd arrange her features into whatever expression she wanted me to see. She was performing for me, and we both knew it. High school brought new challenges. Boys started calling, drawn to her like moths to flame. But she had no interest in the normal teenage romance games. Instead, she'd study them, figure out exactly what they wanted to hear, then use that knowledge to get whatever she needed: homework done, rides, places, money for things she wanted. She was 17 when I overheard her on the phone with Tommy Martinez, the sheriff's son, convincing him to steal exam answers from his father's office, where they kept the school records. The way she played him was masterful and terrifying. That's when I realized my daughter wasn't just smart or even just manipulative. She was something else entirely, something that wore the face of my child but had the soul of a stranger. And for the first time, I started wondering not if something was wrong with Serafina, but what I was going to do about it before she destroyed someone's life, maybe even mine. The night I realized I was living with a monster wearing my daughter's face was 3 weeks after her 18th birthday. She'd graduated valedictorian, naturally, with a full scholarship to study psychology at the state university. Everyone in town was so proud, calling her our local success story, the girl who'd made something of herself despite losing her daddy so young. But success wasn't enough for Serafina. It never was. I'd been having these spells for months, dizzy fits that would come out of nowhere, leaving me weak and confused. The doctor said it was probably my blood pressure, maybe early signs of diabetes, nothing too concerning for a woman my age, but the timing always struck me as odd. The spells would hit hardest right after dinner, when I'd been feeling perfectly fine all day. That particular night, I'd made her favorite fried chicken with mashed potatoes and green beans fresh from the garden. We sat at the kitchen table like we had 1,000 times before, her telling me about her plans for college, how she wanted to specialize in forensic psychology, maybe work with the police to catch criminals. The pride in her voice when she talked about studying the criminal mind should have warmed a mother's heart. Instead, it chilled me to the bone. After dinner, I started feeling that familiar wooziness creeping in. My vision got blurry, and my hands began to shake as I tried to clear the dishes. Serafina jumped up, all concern and gentle hands, helping me to my chair, telling me to rest while she cleaned up. Such a good daughter, anyone watching would have thought. But as she moved around the kitchen, washing dishes and wiping counters, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. She was humming, not unusual in itself, except I recognized the tune. It was the same melody she'd hummed as a child when she was particularly pleased about something, usually after she'd successfully manipulated someone or gotten away with some small cruelty. That's when I saw her slip something small and white back into her pocket. A pill bottle, maybe, or a small envelope. The movement was so quick, so practiced, that if I hadn't been watching her at just that moment, I would have missed it entirely. The pieces started falling into place with horrible clarity. The timing of my spells, the way she'd insist on preparing my evening medication, bringing me water, making sure I took everything the doctor prescribed, the way she'd hover nearby afterward, watching me with those calculating eyes, like she was observing the results of an experiment. My own daughter was poisoning me. Slowly, carefully, probably with something that would mimic natural, age-related health problems, and she was doing it with the same methodical precision she'd applied to everything else in her young life. I excused myself, claiming I needed to lie down, but instead I went to her room. My hands were still shaking, whether from whatever she'd given me or from sheer terror, I couldn't tell. I searched through her drawers, her closet, under her mattress, nothing. She was too smart to leave evidence lying around. But then I remembered her laptop, the one she'd gotten for graduation. She always kept it password protected, claiming it was for privacy. But I'd watched her type it in enough times to memorize it, her father's birthday, combined with the date he died. Even her passwords were calculated to make me feel guilty for snooping. What I found on that computer changed everything I thought I knew about my daughter, and about evil itself. Folder after folder of research. Not the kind of research a psychology student might do for class, but something far more sinister. Detailed studies on undetectable poisons, methods of inducing heart attacks, ways to make murder look like natural death, case studies of successful killers who'd never been caught, forums where she discussed techniques with other like-minded individuals, using screen names and coded language. And then I found the file labeled Practice Subjects, 8 names, 8 people from our town who'd died of seemingly natural causes over the past 3 years. Mrs. Henderson, who'd died of that sudden heart attack. Mr. Jameson, who'd had that fatal stroke at 62. The widow Murphy, whose diabetes had suddenly gotten so much worse. Each death had seemed random, unfortunate but not suspicious. Except my daughter had detailed notes on all of them. Their routines, their medical conditions, their social connections, and in each case, she'd found a way to get close to them, volunteering to help with groceries, offering to run errands, being the sweet, helpful neighbor everyone trusted. My beautiful, brilliant daughter was a serial killer, and I was her latest project. That's when I knew there was no going back. No amount of prayer, no intervention, no mother's love was going to save her soul or protect her future victims. The child I'd raised, worried over, and loved with every fiber of my being had never really existed at all. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. No dizziness, no confusion, no mysterious weakness, probably because for the first time in Lord knows how long, I hadn't taken the evening medications my caring daughter had been so diligent about bringing me. Instead, I'd palmed those pills and flushed them down the toilet after she'd gone to her room. I made breakfast like nothing had changed. Scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with homemade strawberry jam. Serafina came down looking fresh as a daisy, chattering about her plans for the day. how she needed to run some errands in town before meeting with her college advisor. The normalcy of it all made my skin crawl. Here was a young woman who'd killed 8 people, who was slowly murdering her own mother. And she could sit at our kitchen table talking about course schedules and summer jobs like she was any other 18-year-old girl. But I played along. Lord forgive me, I smiled and nodded and asked all the right motherly questions, because I needed time to figure out what to do with the terrible knowledge that was burning a hole in my chest. After she left, I sat at that kitchen table for 3 hours straight, staring at the coffee growing cold in my cup, trying to find a way out of this nightmare that didn't end with more death. Could I go to the police and tell them what? That my daughter was too smart, too calculating, too good at reading people, that she hummed when she was pleased and had research on her computer. They'd think grief and age had finally gotten to the widow Patterson, driven her to paranoid delusions about her own child. The evidence she'd left was all circumstantial, the kind of thing that could be explained away by a gifted student's academic curiosity. Those people had died of natural causes, according to every doctor and coroner who'd examined them. There were no witnesses, no physical proof, nothing but a mother's terrible intuition and some disturbing files on a computer. Besides, who was going to believe that sweet Serafina Red, the girl who helped at church functions and made Dean's List every semester, was capable of systematic murder? I could already hear their voices, sympathetic and condescending. Mrs. Patterson's been under so much stress lately, what with her health problems and Serafina getting ready to leave for college. Sometimes mothers have a hard time letting go. That afternoon, I called her college and told them she'd had a family emergency, that she needed to defer enrollment for a semester. Then I called Dr. Morrison and canceled my appointment for the following week, claiming I was feeling much better and didn't think I needed to keep taking all those medications. When Serafina came home that evening, I could see the confusion in her eyes when I served dinner and ate every bite with genuine appetite. For the first time in months, I wasn't fighting off waves of nausea or struggling to keep my hands steady. She offered to bring me my pills, like always, but I told her I'd decided to take a break from them, see if I could manage without so much medication. The mask slipped for just a moment. I saw frustration flicker across her features, quickly replaced by that concerned daughter expression she wore so well. She suggested that maybe I shouldn't make medical decisions without consulting the doctor, that sudden changes could be dangerous for someone my age. But I held firm, and I watched as she recalculated, adapting to this unexpected variable in what had probably been a carefully planned timeline. That's when I knew for certain that every instinct I'd been fighting was absolutely correct. That night, lying in my bed, listening to her move around the house, I made the hardest decision of my life. I couldn't prove what she'd done, couldn't save the people who were already gone, and couldn't trust anyone to believe me. But I could make sure she never hurt another innocent soul. My husband's old revolver was still in the bedroom closet, wrapped in the same oilcloth where he'd left it 15 years ago. I'd never fired it, barely even touched it, but I knew it still worked. Jim had been meticulous about maintaining his things. Tomorrow night, I decided, after she thought she'd put me to sleep forever, I'd be ready. The next day passed like I was walking through thick honey, every minute stretching out longer than it should. I went through the motions of normal life, watering the tomato plants, sorting through old photographs, calling my sister in Memphis to chat about nothing important, but underneath it all, my heart was pounding like a trapped bird against my ribs. Serafina seemed different too, more watchful. She kept finding excuses to check on me throughout the day, bringing me glasses of sweet tea I didn't want, fluffing pillows that didn't need fluffing, asking how I was feeling with that particular intensity that made my skin crawl. I could practically see the wheels turning in that brilliant mind of hers, trying to figure out why her carefully planned timeline had gotten disrupted. Around 3 in the afternoon, she announced she was going to the pharmacy to pick up a refill of my blood pressure medication. Said she'd spoken to Dr. Morrison's office and they thought it was important I get back on my regular schedule. The lie came so easily, delivered with such convincing concern, that if I hadn't known better, I might have believed her myself. While she was gone, I went to the closet and unwrapped my husband's gun. The metal felt cold and impossibly heavy in my hands. Jim had tried to teach me to shoot years ago, back when we were first married, but I'd never had the stomach for it. Now I found myself trying to remember his instructions, checking to make sure it was loaded, practicing how to hold it steady despite my shaking hands. I was still holding it when I heard her car pull into the driveway 20 minutes earlier than expected. Panic shot through me like lightning. I wrapped the gun back up and shoved it into the closet, my heart hammering so hard I was sure she'd be able to hear it from downstairs. By the time she came through the front door, I was sitting in my rocking chair with a magazine in my lap, trying to look like I'd been peacefully reading, but she knew. Somehow, she knew. She stood in the living room doorway for a long moment, those green eyes of hers scanning the room like she could see traces of what I'd been doing written in the air. Then she smiled that sweet smile and held up a white pharmacy bag. The medication she'd brought wasn't the same pills I'd been taking before. These were different, stronger looking. And when I read the label, I saw they were prescribed for someone named Margaret Willis, an elderly woman who'd died 2 months ago of what everyone assumed was a heart attack in her sleep. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Serafina had somehow gotten hold of a dead woman's heart medication, pills that would probably kill me within hours if I took them. She wasn't planning to poison me slowly anymore. She was done being patient. That evening, she made my favorite supper, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, cornbread with real butter, green bean casserole like her grandmother used to make. She was pulling out all the stops, making sure my last meal would be something special. The thoughtfulness of it, twisted as it was, almost made me want to cry. After dinner, she brought me the pills with a tall glass of water, sitting beside me on the couch like she had when she was little and I'd read her bedtime stories, except now she was waiting to watch me die. I took the pills from her hand and looked down at them. 2 small white tablets that would stop my heart before morning. She watched me with those calculating eyes, probably timing how long it would take, planning what she'd tell the paramedics when she found my body. Instead of swallowing them, I looked up at her and said, I needed to use the bathroom first. Maybe splash some water on my face since I was feeling a bit warm. She nodded, patient as a cat watching a mouse, confident that her plan was finally back on track. In the bathroom, I flushed those pills down the toilet and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me had aged 10 years in 2 days. Tomorrow, I thought, one way or another, this nightmare would be over. I barely slept that night, lying in bed listening to every creak and whisper the old house made, wondering if Serafina would get impatient and decide not to wait for the pills to do their work. Around 3 in the morning, I heard her bedroom door open and the soft pad of her feet on the hallway floorboards. My whole body went rigid under the covers, my hand creeping toward the nightstand drawer where I'd moved the gun after wrapping it in an old pillowcase. But she just stood outside my door for what felt like forever. I could sense her there in the darkness, probably listening for the sound of labored breathing or distressed groans that would tell her the stolen medication was doing its job. When I forced myself to breathe slow and steady, like someone in deep, peaceful sleep, she finally went back to her room. The next morning, she was all fluttery concern, asking how I'd slept. Did I feel all right? Maybe I looked a little pale. I played my part too, complaining of feeling tired and a bit dizzy, letting her help me to the kitchen table like I was frailer than usual. The performance seemed to satisfy her, and I watched some of the tension leave her shoulders. That's when I made my discovery. While she was outside hanging laundry on the line, humming that pleased tune of hers, I decided to search her room one more time. I'd been so focused on her computer before that I'd missed something crucial hidden in plain sight. A journal tucked inside her college psychology textbook, camouflaged to look like class notes. What I found in those pages made the computer files look like child's play. She'd been documenting her kills like a scientist recording experiments. Each victim had a detailed profile, their daily routines, their medical histories, their family situations, and most chilling of all, her method of approach and execution. Mrs. Henderson hadn't died of a sudden heart attack. Serafina had been volunteering to help with her grocery shopping for weeks, slipping digitalis from foxglove flowers into her morning coffee. Mr. Jameson's stroke had been induced by a blood pressure medication swap that she'd managed during one of her helpful visits to organize his pillbox. But it was the last entry that made my knees go weak. It was about me, dated just 2 days ago. She'd written about her disappointment in my sudden resistance to the medication, how she'd had to accelerate her timeline, how she was looking forward to the challenge of making my death look natural despite the change in method. At the bottom of the page, she'd written something that burned itself into my memory. Mother has been an excellent long-term study in gradual elimination. Her death will serve as proof of concept before I begin my real work in college. The psychology program will provide access to so many interesting subjects. Real work. She was planning to use her education, her future career, as a hunting ground. How many people would she kill while hiding behind the respectable facade of a forensic psychologist? How many victims would never know that the professional trying to help them was actually studying them like lab rats, choosing which ones to eliminate? I heard the back door slam and quickly shoved the journal back where I'd found it, but my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the textbook. By the time she came back into the house, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, trying to look normal. She studied my face with those sharp eyes of hers, and I had the horrible feeling that she could read my thoughts as easily as she read everyone else's weaknesses. For a moment, I thought she might confront me, might drop the pretense altogether and finish what she'd started. Instead, she smiled and asked if I'd like her to drive me to town later, maybe stop by the drugstore and pick up some of those vitamins Dr. Morrison had recommended. Always the helpful daughter, always thinking of my health and well-being. That afternoon, as we drove through the familiar streets of Tellico Plains, I looked at the people we passed, neighbors working in their yards, children playing on porches, elderly folks sitting on benches outside the general store, and realized they had no idea that death was riding in the passenger seat of my old Buick, calculating which of them might make interesting subjects for future study. Tonight, I decided. It had to be tonight. That evening felt different from the moment Serafina walked through the front door. There was an electricity in the air, like the heavy stillness that comes before a tornado touches down. She moved through the house with a purposefulness that made every nerve in my body stand on edge. And I noticed she kept checking the time on her watch, something she'd never done before. During dinner, she barely touched her food, just pushed the mashed potatoes around on her plate while watching me eat with an intensity that made my stomach churn. Every bite felt like swallowing stones, but I forced myself to clean my plate, knowing she was waiting for some sign that whatever she'd done was starting to work. After we cleared the dishes, she suggested we sit on the front porch for a while, enjoy the evening air before it got too late, said it might help me feel better if I was having one of my dizzy spells. The concern in her voice was perfect, practiced, but I could see something else flickering behind her eyes. Anticipation. We settled into the old rocking chairs that had been on that porch since before she was born, the same chairs where I'd held her as a baby, where I'd helped her with homework on summer evenings, where I'd waited up for her to come home from dates. Now we sat there like two strangers, each pretending not to know what the other was thinking. That's when she started talking about her college plans again, but this time with details that made my blood run cold. She mentioned how excited she was to work with the campus counseling center, how many students struggled with depression and anxiety, how trust was such an important part of the therapeutic relationship. The way she said it, with that slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth, made it clear she wasn't talking about helping people, she was talking about hunting them. As the sun set and the porch fell into shadow, I felt something shift in the air between us. The pretense was wearing thin, and I could sense her patience running out. She kept glancing toward the house, then back at me, like she was calculating something. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, just a whiff of something sweet and chemical that didn't belong in the evening air. But as the minutes passed, it got stronger, and I realized it was coming from inside the house. My heart started racing as pieces clicked together in my mind. The way she'd insisted we sit outside, the way she kept checking the time, the strange anticipation I'd sensed in her all evening. She'd done something to the house, something that would make my death look accidental. Probably a gas leak or faulty wiring that would cause a fire after I went to bed. She was planning to leave me on that porch until whatever she'd rigged was ready, then help her, dizzy, confused mother inside to rest, where I'd die in what would look like a tragic accident. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't going to be a quiet death in my sleep. She was planning to burn the house down with me in it, destroying any evidence of her previous crimes, along with her latest victim. The perfect solution to tie up all loose ends before starting her new life at college. I tried to keep my face neutral, but something must have shown because she suddenly went very still in her chair, those green eyes fixed on me with laser focus, and for the first time in years, I saw the real Serafina looking back at me. Not the helpful daughter or the brilliant student, but the calculating predator who'd been hiding behind those masks. We stared at each other across that porch as the smell from inside grew stronger. And I knew we'd both reached the same conclusion. The charade was over. She knew that I knew, and I knew that she knew I knew. All that was left was to see who would make the first move. She started to stand up from her rocking chair, probably planning to suggest we go inside now, but I was already moving. My hand went to the pocket of my house dress where I'd hidden my husband's revolver, wrapped in a dish towel to muffle any sound it might make. But as my fingers closed around the gun, I made a terrible discovery. In my nervousness, my desperate hurry to be prepared, I'd grabbed the wrong thing from the closet. What I pulled out wasn't Jim's revolver at all, but an old wooden jewelry box that was roughly the same size and weight. Serafina saw my mistake, and that predator's smile spread across her face like spilled oil. She knew she had me now. Whatever she'd done to the house was ready. I was unarmed and helpless, and there was nothing left to stop her from finishing what she'd started months ago. But sometimes, when you're cornered with no way out, you discover reserves of strength you never knew you had. The moment Serafina saw that jewelry box in my trembling hands, her whole demeanor changed. The mask of the concerned daughter fell away completely, and what was left was something that made my soul recoil. She stood up slowly from her rocking chair, and for the first time in 18 years, I was looking at my daughter without any pretense between us. She didn't say anything at first, just studied me with those calculating eyes, while the chemical smell from inside the house grew stronger. Then she started walking toward the front door, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew they held all the cards. She was going to go inside, probably to check on whatever device she'd set up, and then come back to help her confused, disoriented mother into the house where the tragic accident would claim both our lives. But something in me snapped when I watched her turn her back on me like I was already dead, like I was just another problem she'd solved with her brilliant mind. Rage flooded through me, not just at what she'd done, but at all the years I'd second-guessed myself, all the times I'd pushed down my instincts because a mother shouldn't think such things about her child. I threw that jewelry box as hard as I could at the back of her head. It caught her right at the base of her skull with a solid thunk that would have been satisfying if the situation hadn't been so desperate. She stumbled forward, more surprised than hurt, and spun around to face me with fury blazing in her eyes. For a split second, she looked like the tantrum-throwing toddler she'd never been, shocked that someone had dared to strike back. That's when I ran. Not toward the road or the neighbors. There wasn't time for that. And besides, who would believe me? Instead, I ran back into the house, racing through the living room toward the bedroom where I'd left the real gun. The chemical smell was overwhelming now, making my eyes water and my head spin, but I pushed through it. Behind me, I could hear Serafina following, her footsteps quick and purposeful on the hardwood floors. She was saying something, probably trying to convince me to calm down, to let her help me, but I couldn't make out the words over the pounding of my own heartbeat. I burst into the bedroom and dove for the closet, my hands frantically searching through the pile of old clothes and blankets where I'd hidden Jim's revolver. My fingers closed around the familiar weight of it just as Serafina appeared in the doorway. She stopped when she saw the gun in my hands, but she didn't look afraid. If anything, she looked annoyed, like I was a puzzle that was taking longer to solve than she'd anticipated. She started talking then, using that soothing voice she'd perfected over the years, trying to convince me that I was confused, that the stress and my medical problems were making me paranoid. But I wasn't listening to her words anymore. I was watching her eyes, seeing the cold calculation behind every syllable. She was still working angles, still trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage. Even now, with a gun pointed at her chest, she believed she was smarter than me, that she could talk her way out of this like she'd talked her way out of everything else. That's when I understood that this would never end. Even if I somehow survived a night, even if I managed to expose her, she would find a way to destroy me and anyone else who stood in her way. She was too smart, too charming, too good at wearing whatever mask the situation required. The only way to stop a monster, I realized, was to become one yourself. I thought about Mrs. Henderson, dying alone in her kitchen, about Mr. Jameson, whose children still blamed themselves for not visiting more often before his sudden stroke, about all the future victims whose names were probably already written in that terrible journal of hers. My finger found the trigger, and for the first time in months, my hands stopped shaking. Tomorrow, the newspapers would call me a monster. The whole town would whisper about the woman who murdered her own daughter in cold blood. But tonight, I was just a mother doing what mothers do, protecting her children, even if those children belonged to someone else. The sound of that gunshot echoed through our little house like the crack of Judgment Day itself. One moment my daughter was standing in the bedroom doorway, still trying to convince me with that silver tongue of hers that I was just a confused old woman having delusions. And the next moment she was crumpled on the floor with a hole in her chest and blood spreading across the yellow dress I'd bought her for Easter just 2 months before. The silence that followed was deafening. No more calculating words, no more manipulation, no more of that terrible humming she did when she was pleased with herself, just the smell of gunpowder mixing with whatever chemical she'd used to rig the house, and the sound of my own ragged breathing filling the space where my daughter's voice used to be. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, holding Jim's revolver and staring down at what I'd done. Seraphine's eyes were still open, still that same beautiful green color, but there was nothing behind them anymore. No intelligence, no calculation, no predatory awareness, just empty glass reflecting the ceiling light. That's when the full weight of it hit me. I had killed my own child, the baby I'd carried for 9 months, the little girl I'd rocked to sleep countless nights, the brilliant young woman who should have had her whole life ahead of her. Whatever else she'd become, whatever monster had grown inside that beautiful shell, she was still my daughter, and I had put a bullet through her heart. I sank down onto the edge of the bed, still clutching the gun, and for the first time in years, I cried. Not the silent tears I'd shed over her cruelties, or the fearful weeping of the past few days, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from the very bottom of my soul. I cried for the daughter I'd never really had, for the mother I'd failed to be, for all the victims whose deaths I couldn't undo, even though their killer was finally stopped. The chemical smell was getting stronger, making me dizzy and nauseous. I knew I needed to get out of the house, call the police, face whatever consequences were coming for me. But first, I had to be sure. With shaking hands, I felt for a pulse at her neck, checking what I already knew. Serafina was gone. I called 911 from the kitchen phone, my voice surprisingly steady as I told the dispatcher that I'd shot my daughter, that she was dead, and that they needed to send someone right away. The woman on the other end kept asking questions. Was I hurt? Was the shooter still in the house? Did I need an ambulance? But I just repeated the facts. My name, my address, what I'd done. While I waited for the sirens, I went back to her room one last time and retrieved that terrible journal from inside her textbook. The police would need to see it, would need to understand why I'd done what I'd done. Maybe they'd believe me, maybe they wouldn't, but at least the truth would be on record somewhere. 20 minutes later, my house was full of strangers, paramedics, police officers, detectives, all of them trying to make sense of what had happened. They were professional but wary, the way people get around someone who's just committed an act that goes against every natural law. I told them everything, about the journal, about the computer files, about the years of small cruelties and mounting fears. I showed them the evidence, explained about the chemical smell and what I believed she'd been planning. Some of them listened with open minds, but I could see the skepticism in others' eyes. A mother killing her honor student daughter. It was easier to believe I'd snapped under some imaginary pressure than to accept that evil could wear such a beautiful, accomplished face. They arrested me right there in my living room, reading me my rights while my daughter's body was wheeled out in a black bag. As they put the handcuffs on my wrists, I looked around at the home where I'd spent 43 years, knowing I'd probably never see it again. But as they led me away, one thing gave me a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. The monster was finally gone. 15 years. That's how long I spent behind bars for doing what the state of Tennessee called first-degree murder. But what I knew in my heart was the only choice I'd had left. The trial was a circus, just like I'd expected. The prosecution painted me as a jealous, unstable mother who couldn't handle her daughter's success. They called expert witnesses who testified about empty nest syndrome and latent mental illness. Anything to explain away what I'd done, without having to consider that I might have been telling the truth. My court-appointed lawyer tried his best, bless his heart, but the evidence I'd found in Seraphine's room had mysteriously disappeared from police custody before the trial. They claimed there'd been a computer malfunction that corrupted the files, and that journal I'd shown them, lost in processing, they said, probably misfiled somewhere in the system. Convenient how all the proof of my daughter's true nature just vanished like morning mist. But here's the thing they couldn't make disappear: the pattern that emerged after Seraphine's death. It took me 12 years in prison to piece it together. 12 years of writing letters to newspapers in neighboring counties, requesting obituaries and death notices from the time before my daughter died. What I found would have vindicated me if anyone had been willing to listen. You see, Tellico Plains wasn't the only place my daughter had been active. During her high school years, when she'd taken those weekend trips to visit colleges, when she'd volunteered for church missions in other towns, when she'd claimed to be studying with friends in different counties, she'd been expanding her hunting ground. The deaths hadn't just stopped in our town after I killed her. They'd stopped in a dozen other places too. Elderly folks in nursing homes she'd visited. Lonely widowers she'd befriended at church socials 3 towns over. College students from campuses where she'd attended summer programs. All natural deaths, all perfectly explainable. All clustered around the times and places where my brilliant daughter had been spreading her wings. By the time I got out of prison 3 weeks ago, I'd documented 43 suspicious deaths that had stopped occurring the night I pulled that trigger. 43 people whose families never knew how close they'd come to losing someone to a predator who wore the face of an angel. The house was still here when I got back, though the state had sold it to pay for my legal fees and the restitution they said I owed Seraphine's estate. The new owners, a young couple with 2 small children, were kind enough to let me walk through it one last time before I moved into the little apartment above Miller's grocery store. Standing in that bedroom where it all ended, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not happiness, mind you, but a deep, settled calm that comes from knowing you did the right thing even when the whole world told you it was wrong. Yesterday, I got a letter from a detective in Georgia who'd read one of the many letters I'd sent over the years. He'd been investigating a series of deaths at a college campus from 20 years ago, deaths that had stopped abruptly when a psychology student named Sarah Patterson had transferred schools. Turns out my daughter had been using different names, creating new identities wherever she went. That detective believes me. Says he's reopening several cases, looking into connections I'd found between the victims and a young woman who matched Seraphine's description. It won't bring back any of her victims, and it won't clear my name in the eyes of this town. But it's something. I'm 72 years old now, and I don't have many years left on this earth, but I'm not afraid anymore. I've made my peace with what I did, and with the God who guided my hand that terrible night 15 years ago. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is stop their child from becoming something worse than death itself. If my story has touched your heart, if you understand why a mother might have to make the hardest choice in the world, then maybe you could help my words find their way to other souls who need to hear them. Share this story with someone who might be struggling with their own impossible decisions, because sometimes we all need to know we're not alone in the darkness. I'm still here in Tellico Plains, still baking pies for the church and feeding stray cats, still saying grace before every meal. And I want to hear from you. What town are you watching this from? I'd love to know how far these old words of mine have traveled.